I am an artist, an alchemist, a lover, a guardian. When I enter the room, I bring the all of who I am. There is no filter, no second-guessing presentation of character, no mask. I come to the table strikingly present, powerfully seated in my being, fully attuned and strong, exuding the strength within me and that of my ancestors. For we are all standing before you when I rise to speak. All right. So from here, the way we do it is, to get comfortable. So it's a mound. So start kind of bringing it out. And we'll keep one layer. So as you pat it down, you'll begin to see kind of like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And just kind of, take it out. It's kind of like kneading dough. Yeah. And then if you see any gaps, try and fill those. They don't have to be like super filled, but and if you see too much of a concentration of one color, you can shift that too. They've all got to be no straggling. They've all got to be in communication.
Good evening. My name is Toby Sisson, and I'm here with acclaimed artist Nafis M. for the second event in the Arts Worcester Speakers Series. Artist to Artist, Past is Prologue. We're in conversation today to increase the visibility, understanding, and appreciation of Black art and artists in our community. Our host and sponsor, Arts Worcester, is an organization that has engaged artists and the public to advance and celebrate contemporary art for over 40 years. Thank you all for joining us. I'll facilitate the conversation with questions for our guest about her practice as an artist living and working in New England. If time permits, we'll try to take a few questions from the audience towards the end of the hour. Please post them in the chat section, and if we're unable to address your questions, they will help inform future conversations. First, let's start with introductions. Again, my name is Toby Sisson. I'm an artist and associate professor and director of the studio art program at Clark University. In addition to drawing, painting, and printmaking, my work includes community-based service learning, collaborative public art, and curatorial projects. My creative research focuses on issues of history, place, and identity within the context of race and ethnicity. I exhibit my art nationally and internationally with works in public and private collections, most recently at Brown University and the Worcester Art Museum. Right now, you're looking at works on your screen by Nafis M. She's my guest this evening, and she's an interdisciplinary artist whose recent body of works are created from objects commonly found in beauty supply stores, industrial sites, and the seemingly limitless horizons of our global and political landscapes. Through weaving, hairdressing, sculpture, and installation, White centers the uncanny audacity of self-affirmation and love by means of repetition as a form of change. White draws inspiration from the rich diaspora of experiences and traditions of Black beauty and self-care that honors, celebrates, and values the innovation, technology, and imagination carried through generations of Black culture. White holds an MFA and a BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design. Her work is in the permanent collection of the RISD Museum and the University of New York Mexico Art Museum, and has been exhibited at the de Young Museum, the RISD Museum, National Queer Arts Festival, the List Gallery at Brown University, the New Museum, Goldsmiths University, Autograph ABP, OXO Tower in London, Overture Center for the Arts Madison, and the Rhode Island School of Design, among many others. She lives and works in Providence, Rhode Island. Thank you, Nafis, for bringing your expertise and unique perspective to this conversation. Past is Prologue.
Thank you so much for having me, Toby. Thank you, Arts Worcester, for having me. So I'm beyond excited, to be here and to be in conversation with something that I love dearly, which is art and art making and community activism and engagement. So can't wait. I know we're going to dive into some things tonight. So, and thank you all for being here with us on this journey tonight. You could have been anywhere else, but you're here with us. So thank you for coming in.
Absolutely. When you and I first began discussing your participation in the speaker series, we wondered about the state of the world. I remember we had a great and long phone conversation, and we kept talking about everything that was happening. And it was within the context of art creation in the midst of multiple pandemics. So there's public health, there's economic inequality, and we're, in the midst of an ongoing fight for racial justice. And I think we can now add the recent insurrection on the US Capitol too. Can you talk a little bit about how those forces have affected you as an artist?
Yeah. Wow. Yes. Wow. What a year. What a past couple years. My goodness. Yes. So how have I been impacted? I mean, it has been tumultuous. I am reminded actually, there's a thing that ancestor Toni Morrison says about this is the time when artists come alive. That this is the time where we, find our calling, deeply sit into and access the gifts that we have, whatever those gifts are, and use those to positively impact the world around, to bear witness, to be a recorder, to be present, and to share, to collaborate, to build with others. And so that is kind of where, that's where I went, when all of these crises were happening, when the pandemic was happening, I went out often. Because I felt like I needed to bear witness to the landscape. I needed to see it, I needed to hear it, I needed to smell it. Seeing the, vacancies everywhere, the lack of people, the lack of cars, the sounds were different, the smells were different. To witness that and then start to understand along with everybody else, what can we do? And how can we stay safe, but still build, in an artistic capacity? What can we do to inspire, especially during a time that is so depressing and so scary? I mean, this was early on. We didn't know what was going on exactly. As far as the movement for Black lives, we were still being killed, going for a jog, you lose your life, going for a walk, you lose your life, you're in bed, you lose your life. There were all of these different things that were happening in simultaneity, that aren't different, by the way, than any other time period in this country's history. But the difference is, being able to record it and see it. But the challenge with that also artistically is how do you process that kind of trauma that you are witness to? And then how can you use what you have to speak about it or to do something about it, to advocate? So there are all of these things, like you said, happening, and so how as an artist, what do you do? And, for me, the answer has been to lean into the fear, you know, um, understand the parameters, but do it anyway, but do it with intentionality. And by doing it, what do I mean? I mean, at the time I had access to a print shop when the pandemic really took off. And this was also, right after Breonna Taylor had been murdered and all of that. And um, the power that comes with having access to a print shop, and then the knowledge, because I've been trained as a printmaker among many other things. I mean, I've got a family member who's a master printmaker and painter. I too, know how to do that. So letterpress, offset, screen print, whatever. And I was able to bring in community members who I knew would hold very sacred, the concerns around COVID and transmission, who would not only be able to show up, but, be very caring with each other, and we could lean on each other. But we could also work in tandem and collaboratively to create suites of posters, artwork really, right? To disperse, across the city, and going to different protests or vigils, and in some cases leading them, to be able to have conversations with other people. It's kind of, again, goes back to Toni Morrison. It's like, are you seeing what I'm seeing? Is this of concern to you? You're meeting community members who are saying, yes, this is unacceptable. I don't like this. No, we cannot treat people in these ways, and not just Black people. You know what I mean? Because we have been living in a time that is very, has a lot of phobias around a lot of different people, So there's a lot of things that you can say, poetically, artistically, especially, in a very democratic, art making technique, of printmaking. You can get that information out there, and inspire people to not only know that other people think like them, that think about love, think about community, think about, how can we do this together? How can we build? How can we make life better? How can we make our community better? How can we make, change for our children, our families? And so, to see people not only receive that, but then put posters, throughout the city, in windows, that we had worked on, collaboratively. I mean, that was a saving grace for me as an artist, because I needed community nearby. I needed to know that I was held, and I needed to make sure that other people knew that I was holding them, you know.
Yeah.
And that was a big part of, I think, for many of us, what was able to keep us, going and inspired, instead of sinking into depression, which helped me generate work in many other realms even after that, so it was a way to revive. Yeah, but it touched a lot of people, and that work really mattered.
Yeah, I think you've done a really wonderful job in helping us understand, at least for me, what the sort of interior dialogue was, that
Yeah.
and how you were processing everything that's been happening for us most recently, and then a long legacy of sort of historic ideas that are influencing your work. I wonder
Mhm.
if you could also talk a little bit about the significance of your public performance works. So as we start to maybe look at a few of the images, we have a video, we have a number of still things. We can also see right now on the screen some of those posters that you were referencing,
Yeah.
political content.
Mhm.
I wonder if you can talk about the work at a time when we're in a health crisis that restricts our movements to the home, right? Yet and
Mhm.
still, you're still doing things in the public sphere. Can you
Yeah.
talk about why you choose to do that at a time when we've all been sort of told to stay on lockdown?
Oh, wow. Um, Wow. I'm just sitting with that for a moment, because, I'm thinking about, right, like seeing this slide that says state of urgency. I was like, just thinking to myself, the urgency of being out, the urgency, being in my body as a Black woman, as a queer Black woman. And then what does that do when you're out in space? I'm surveilled a lot, and then I also feel like I walk through this world with, kind of a very Du Boisian kind of, double consciousness, in terms of, having to intuit what other people may be thinking about me or creating about me. in order for me to stay safe. And so I think in some ways, the most courageous thing that I could do at any time, really, but especially during this time, was to really be visible, like really to stand in my power, you know, and use my body as conduit for change, and have it be symbolic in these ways. So in this case, with all the posters, that was, kind of reading everything, seeing everything that's happening, responding to all of these different matters, in this way, and then, creating a tapestry using the city, as a canvas, and using people as conduit, and then having that, seen here as an accumulation of all of these, memorials, like, acclamations, like, so it's beautiful to see here. For myself, when you ask about me going into the public, there was one time actually on the day that it was announced that Biden, was to become president, and Kamala Harris. I remember distinctly being in a really vibrant, beautiful floral gown, because I do that. That's another art practice of mine during COVID, is to dress to the nines and take walks dressed impeccably. My dresses have trains sometimes, just, and this is a video of me actually. There were Trump supporters at the Capitol. I had a feeling like I needed to process, needed to walk. When I got the news about Biden Harris, I was so filled with all this energy, because I thought, wow, we are witnessing real time the shift of power, the audacity of hope, to quote Barack Obama, like, what is possible? And then as I neared the Capitol, I noticed that there was a whole line of Trump supporters who were saying, this is a hoax, and the election was stolen, and this is an abomination, and all of these things, but I felt very strongly, especially with the Capitol as a backdrop, and especially with me dressed in this very floral kind of regalia, and yellow being present in my attire, and color theory, being what it is, and thinking about the injection of yellow, like, what is that? Joy, transcendence, jubilation, optimism, all of these things, right? On this canvas of a dress. And I wanted to be a barrier, a peaceful barrier between the Trump supporters and the Capitol building, because I thought it was important that Rhode Island, being the largest slaving state, in terms of the Brown family, not only profiteering, but, basically dominating the slave trade. And having there be such a history here, even the auctioning of slaves, nearby where the Capitol building is, so many riots, so many murders of Black and Indigenous people, and all of these things. So I felt, and like a call, if you will, from ancestry, and just the need to be there, and the need to use my body as an instrument, artistically, but to change the way that this landscape is perceived. If I can inject myself into the conversation and break into the line of these people who, now that we've seen this insurrection this week, I mean, my God, you see just how far not only people go, but how blue lives really don't matter to them, or like all of these things, these it was important, all the things that we have been like, oh, maybe this is very hate filled, or there's, all this energy behind it. I mean, at that time, it seemed very important to challenge a lot of that hate, and a lot of the policies which involve terrorism, like terrorizing children, terrorizing immigrants, terrorizing Black people, like all of these things. It was important to be a beacon of light in that particular arena. And I didn't plan. It wasn't something that I planned to do. Like, I'm going to do a performance piece at the Capitol and just, ta-da, but I felt compelled, once I was there. And I thought the kind of action, what is the thing that I can give? I'm an artist who started creating visual art after working so long in performance and dance. So my body as instrument seemed to be the right way to process the joy of this news, but to also invoke the ancestors, but also to be present in this space in a non-threatening way.
Yeah.
To be able to make a statement without saying anything at all.
Well, I think what you do in this act is you
Mhm.
remind us all as viewers, for our audience, of how
Mhm.
Black and brown bodies behaving in unexpected ways in the public sphere is always a revolutionary act.
Oh,
And, I think about artists like Adrian Piper or William Pope L., and there's a long history of that kind of action.
mhm.
But you're not confined to performance work. I think you do some really wonderful and equally exciting things in the objects and the images that you create. So for instance, I'm thinking
Mhm.
specifically about your woven and beaded works.
Yes.
How do you draw on traditional practices,
Mhm.
weaving, beads, sort of traditional sculptural forms? How
Mhm.
do you use them to comment on contemporary issues? Just precisely what you've been talking about. How do you make that translation?
Okay, so how do I make that translation? There's a couple different ways. So I am multiracial, I have family from England, Scotland, from the deep south, by way of Ghana, so in Cameroon. So the ways in which I kind of use those root systems, with this piece that we're looking at right here, a burst of light is made entirely of hair. It is synthetic hair. I have been studying hair work and specifically African American traditions. So twisting, braiding, wire work. And then I've been melding and adornment, so accumulation, not only in using hair, but also decorative elements. And then merging that with traditional Victorian hair weaving. So it's memento mori, which is much more, well, when we look at mourning wreaths, for example, when people used to take locks of hair and create little flowers and things like that and create little wreaths, they did it when people were still alive. So you would have a beautiful wreath in a home that was made by women who were just, honoring all the women in the family, mother, aunts, the children, cousins. And it would be this bouquet, that would have white hair and black hair, brown hair, blonde hair, Um, and so I was very, and that of course, when people pass away, then it's a little more morose, and I actually collect those items because I'm very interested, not only in the historical significance of them, but also, as somebody who is really interested also in jewelry fabrication. I'm very interested in that very small wire work and the kind of tension that you need for that in order to do it. So we've got different inspiration points. And so, I kind of, in a lot of ways, I call these works love letters, because, the thing that you can do to elevate yourself and elevate those around you that you care about is to spend time. And to create these works takes time and endurance and repetition. And it takes being in a meditative space. I have a very ritualistic practice with all of these different hair works. It often means clearing the room, burning sage or Palo Santo, like being in the space, transforming the environment, and then building from there. So yes, let's see here. I'm just having a closer look at these. Right, these are called oculus. These are a recent development in my practice because uh, the circle has become really important in how I create and build. And as we are in these cyclical movements, I find it to be very, very powerful. You start to see things appearing and disappearing and coming back. And I reference the Victorian era work in that, they do a lot of very intricate flower work. But what I've been doing is not, kind of riffing off of that, but building my own forms and that kind of thing. So what these works do is really honor just they honor Black people. It's a reclamation. It is, it is a love letter. It is a devotional work. They take the larger the 8-foot pieces take months, and there's just in that headspace of, love and peace. There's something about it, about creating in that way and creating beauty, like bringing it all together and allowing a piece that's made out of this material that people might not think is so lovely, to create an artwork out of, but to make it gorgeous and to really represent my background in a way that is lush, and generative, and has all of these different facets to it, all of these different points of like, shift and change, that really talk about, time,
Mhm.
so yeah, so that's why these pieces in particular, and to be quite honest, in my body of work, which like you said is pretty extensive, I mean, I love to play, and there's a lot of materials I like to use, there's a lot of ideas that I have, and there's a lot of things that I have to say, like the
Mhm.
body of work that's going to come after this insurrection, trust me, it's going to it's going to be lush, and not in the way that the hair works are lush, right? It's going to have a different resonance. It's going to have a different, kind of timbre. But these works really are. I mean, they're bold. They're even more colorful in person. Some people have described them almost as if they're like almost mask-like, to be able to draw different kind of figures. And I love interweaving different colors and shifting, like just really kind of, making them vibrate, in the space, which I think also for me is a nod to the fact that 400 years since arrival to these shores, ancestors, being kidnapped and sold, and labeled subhuman and all of this, that we have yet endured, and that we are, we are more beautiful in some ways, even after being broken. We continue to innovate, continue to bring beauty, continue to share love and warmth, with the world. And I think that is miraculous and a testament. And so these works really are about that, they're really about that. They're celebratory, they're complex, you know.
Mhm.
They're, so
Yeah, I mean, they are undeniably beautiful. And so I can't help but immediately thinking about their display. So I love
mm,
that we have some shots, some installation shots of these here, which immediately brings to mind the spaces in which they might be exhibited.
yes, yeah.
Um, what kinds of expectations should we have as a public, as an audience, and maybe for yourself as an
Mhm.
artist, um, for galleries, for museums, for art venues, for addressing the legacy of equality that these works are about? Like, they are about beauty and joy, but they
Right,
also conjure up some of the pain that you were speaking of and referencing
right,
historically. So, what are
right.
the expectations that we should have for galleries and museums, in terms of their responsibility for addressing that legacy of inequality?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a great question. I think that museums are beginning to do the work around that.
Mhm.
And what I have been witnessing is, there have been more acquisitions, there's been more research into artists previously unknown, just not, touted, but, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, even before, there's more discussion in art history about people who made contributions. And so I think that, really kind of, looking back at the history and correcting that, bringing more people into that conversation, looking deeply into collections, and also looking into how to display within collections.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really important. I witnessed this, and I was fairly critical about it actually when I went to the Met recently, which was, you go in and you're like, oh, Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg and, da, 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 da. And then you go to another, Yves Klein, and you've got Pollock and da, da, da. And you go to another floor, and then it's like, here, we've got, Black and Indigenous and Latinx and da, da. And I just felt like, well, isn't there were artists of these backgrounds creating during these times. Like, and in fact, we could even question and say, who was Pollock watching? Or who were these artists paying attention to, who maybe had more access, more resource, et cetera, and then were able to create what they create. I'm just asking the question, but I think that we need to be in the room. And by we, I mean people who have been traditionally disenfranchised from all of these spaces. Let us, and I mean us, and there's a big us, but let's all be in conversation, in these spaces. I think that could help. But I'm cautious about, I applaud the acquisitions, and I think that's important. I'm very wary of like the Black arts movement, and then also 30 years later, in the 90s, it's like, oh, let's get this work, and then nothing for decades. I mean, we have seen this historically play out where Black art, Indigenous art, Latinx art, Asian art becomes a fad, and then something you procure, and then you're like, okay, good, we're done for a little while, and we'll get back to it. I mean, and I think that we're seeing a big change when we look at, diversity of staff, diversity of curators, diversity around the kinds of questions around exhibition, like what do we want to say, and what are we interested in knowing about, and also who are the communities that we are around, and are we in some ways a mirror to their voices, are they part of this conversation, also. So I think that there's work being done. And while I celebrate that, I would love to see even more, even more resources used, invitations given. And I say this often, I'm not interested so much in like performance of care. I'm interested in sustained action over time.
So how is that going to change the mission? I'm on board with you here.
Mhm,
1,000%. So if we change these positions of power to be more
yes,
diverse, board memberships, curatorial staff,
sure,
exhibition committees, collection committees,
right.
how are we expecting within these institutions, how it's going to change their mission, their operations, or even audience expectations? Like there's so many layers to this as well.
Wow. Yeah. Wow, that yeah, there's a lot of layers to that. I mean, how to change expectations? I mean, um, right. How do you reinvent yourself? Like what is needed? I mean, I think taking a temperature on what is happening locally and globally, and really kind of deep diving into that, and staying on the pulse of things, and being open and willing, not only for discussion, but to try things, and see what works, and see, what dialogues are fruitful, I think that we've seen in a lot of ways that there's particular patterns and particular, ways of moving up in these places, and, particular ways in which we do things, we show things, we acquire things. And I think all of that can be, kind of shaken up a little bit, like let's review and see how do these policies impact, how they impact us, are we growing, are we learning, how are we benefiting from that, is it making our life more rich, because I think that if the structure is just, continuing as it has, I mean, there's not, it kind of, yeah, it's not, it deadens, its ability to grow, and just reinforces this kind of hierarchy and this power structure. And so, and if we really want change and need change, I mean, we have to be willing to look at things a little bit differently, and be willing to try, and be more than that, be willing to fail, you know, we were not always going to get it right the first time out. But I do feel like, you know, people will be encouraged if they see it, you know, people will be encouraged. And, you know, who's to say? I was like, oh, nobody wants to see Black art. How do you know? You know what I mean? Or like,
That
right?
this will, are you optimistic that institutions are committed to sustained change, or do you think they're performing wokeness at this moment, this sort of pivotal moment where everything is top of mind right now?
Toby, they gonna have to, if I may just be direct. You know, I appreciate what I am seeing. And I am seeing in places all over the country, you know, people coming, you know, activating. And I'm hoping that it's more than just a performance of wokeness. I am really, really hoping that people are committed.
Mhm.
Committed, yeah. And really time will tell, you know, time will tell. And I think that it's nice to have community involved in all of these different ways to hold those missions to account. And not just Black people. I mean, I feel like also, I mean, everybody has richness and culture. I think that it's important for, you know, for work, you know, to be shared, you know, that so that people, everyone sees themselves. You know, I think that's really an important facet. And so I think if it is an institution, for example, that maybe mainly collects European work, that, you know, that if it's mostly a staff that's also, you know, Caucasian, then, you know, how is there development and growth there? You know, maybe those people can also say, hey, we're being deprived of some richness here. You know, I want to learn and grow, you know, and you know, sharpen myself off of, you know, the intellect and innovation also of others, you know, not just those from our communities. So I think we will see over time. I think we
Okay.
will see demonstrated over time.
You know, and I do
But it's
share
got to be
your
checked
optimism. Yeah, I share your optimism
off.
about that. But I'm always
Mhm.
cautiously optimistic as I see the beginnings or the emergence of change. I think we're at that sort of chrysalid emergent moment where things could
Mhm.
blossom and bloom. But we often know that great change can sometimes be followed by a backlash. And
Right.
I'm interested in another facet of this,
Right.
as a matter of
Mhm.
fact. How do institutions avoid commodifying Black pain or issues that of discrimination and loss or degradation as a result of their focus on injustice and suffering? How do they make that balance? Like you talked earlier about being
Mm,
so thoughtful about incorporating beauty and joy
mhm.
and celebration
Yeah.
into this work. How do institutions modulate that so that there isn't just an exclusive focus on
Mhm.
Black pain?
Right.
How do they navigate that?
Well, um, that's another great question. You know, because I think that, you know, great art can come from love, great art can come from pain, right? And that there's a huge body of work out there that is created because, and I've created some as well. You know, I did a piece after Michael Brown was murdered. There was a neon work that said, "Can I get a witness?" Which was, you know, kind of a call to action, and also like, you know, just saying, and it's a phrase that is used often in Black communities, but also like, do you see what I'm seeing? You
Mhm.
know? And so I saw that work, which was a part of a series, you know, just like, you know, there was a lot of interest in it and people wanted to purchase it like for collections and that kind of thing. And it was such a painful piece to do. It was wrenching, you know. I've got family in Ferguson. I've like, you know, hearing from them, like having to show double IDs to get on their street and the kind of harassment they were experiencing and all of this kind of stuff. And, you know, which is, you know, which was just on the outer tier of like, you know, seeing this young man murdered, you know, and then body on display in the street for hours. I mean, it was the most painful, and not even to be directly there, but to have also, you know, when those kinds of pieces are created or those kinds of things happen, you think about where you were. You think, you know, for me at least, you know, I thought about the time when I was a child and my dad was pulled over by a police officer, you know, when I saw his body in the street, I thought of my brother who, was pulled over by a police and they murdered his dog, in front of him. Like, I think, you just go to these places where, um, where the pain is really intense. And then those works are important markers in history, those kinds of artworks. Um, and I think that collections are very interested in having works that are charged. I think of Andy Warhol's image of the man being, the Black man being bitten by the dog, or, there's so much work like that. But that's not the only representation that has to exist,
Mhm.
and that's also, when I went, to see Warhol's work, I mean, that was extremely triggering and traumatic, and so it's important to see. I'm a little emotional around this. It's important to see yourselves and not just being murdered. You know what I mean? And, or to when you're using your art practice to process the levels, and dare I say, even generations of pain around this kind of thing. That the commodification that you're talking about is like, people are like, oh, that's so hot. Let's get that or put that in the collection. Like, this is a timestamp, very urgent work. I think that while they are important works, and this work for me was a huge piece for me, but it really, but people were more interested in, like, kind of the origin of it, as opposed to answering the call, which is, what are you going to do to help us, like, and change policy and just bear witness and understand the kind of levels of this, the kind of generational levels of this, and to shift that dynamic, to make it end, like, make these executions end, so going back to the museum and acquisition, honey, if you can look at if you can go through Picasso's periods, and, like, go go through, like, you can look diligently and with great care and study around the layers of Black and Brown and Asian and Indigenous experience.
Mhm.
It's not all pain and death, but in this country, that is a lot of what we experience,
Yeah. And
also.
it's the history that we have to be able to, as you so correctly say, bear witness to,
Mhm.
simultaneous to celebrating all of the wonderful contributions that we can also make with our work. A
That's right.
question came in, and I'm going to veer off my
So let's veer.
question,
Yeah.
because I think it's a really good one. So
Mhm.
this questioner, this audience member asks, oops,
Mhm.
just there, given that we're looking for change and commitment,
Yes.
when you are invited to participate in a show, how do
Yes.
you decide if you will or you won't?
Mm.
Are
That's
there things in the formulation of a show that
uh,
you're always weighing or gauging, thinking, this is something I definitely want to participate in? You
mhm.
know, is it the credibility of the institution?
Mhm.
Is it the theme of the show? Is it the other artists that you would be exhibiting with? What are some of those factors that you take into consideration that
Yeah.
honor what you do as an artist and what you've been sharing with us this evening?
Yeah.
How do you make that decision?
How do I make the decision? So a lot of factors, there's a lot of factors that go into it. The biggest factor for me is, are people coming to me, with an appreciation of the work, with some knowledge of what I do, and not being tokenizing, right? So I have been approached because people needed Black people in shows, and didn't understand the scope of the work, didn't respect the scope of the work. I do not consider myself a fill-in, you know, and just like any other person who really believes in what they do, I won't accept being tokenized. So I really appreciate when people do their homework, when people are looking, when people understand with what care and intentionality, I move within the world and move within my art practice. It does matter to me who I'm showing with, actually. And it depends on the institution as well. If the institution has not had a very good running, or if I have heard that other, BIPOC people have had, tremendous trouble, who have been perhaps, profiled within that institution, given a really hard time, treated with a lot of disrespect, then I won't engage with that institution, and if there are artists, and that goes for artists of color too, there are people who, also want to profit, off of Black pain, and that can also include other artists, Black artists, so I'm or artists who, have questionable politics, then I will also say no. I have said no actually recently to a few different shows for those reasons. Some of which some of the artists, their practice is, oh, see, now you getting me to spill some tea. I'm not going to name names, but I felt like I'm an intellectual. I felt like some of the work was really lazy, and felt like the work actually tokenized as well. And it was a little bit of, empty. And, I also, if I am coming into the room and I bring a level of integrity and care, love, adoration, serious studies, serious devotion to what I do, then my expectation or my desire is to show with other people who are going to sharpen me. I want to have a like with you, Toby. Oh my God. When we showed at Jamestown, I was just like, Toby, like, yes.
That was a lot of fun.
Wow. It was intellectually delicious. It was an important show with, and that was called Case Rising at Jamestown Art Museum. It was with people who were willing to be vulnerable, and who were so deeply in love with the practice and have such a sense of urgency around it, and who create in a way that you can feel that. I mean, it transcends the medium and goes out. Like, those are the kind of conversations that I want to have artistically. Those are the people who I want in the room, who are going to make me go back to my studio and say, I want to be better, or I need to study this thing, or I am so inspired. That's what that show, and that's what you are to me, is just, just a gift artistically to this world. I mean, I just, I continually aspire. And so I will not be in a room where there are people who are not ready. And it's okay not to be ready, but it's also okay for me not to show with you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Someone asked a question.
That's a great question too. I've got another, and this is on the same thing. This is just, I don't know if it's the same audience member, if it's someone else who's responding.
Okay. May I really quickly? Someone asked about, can I get a witness? That is, I think approximately 36 inches and 18 inches, and then about, that deep. So the piece, when it's there, I mean, it's there, this white light that you cannot escape from, but go ahead.
Yeah. And any of the pieces that you want to go back to and refer to specifically, I mean, please feel free to do that.
Okay.
So our questioner asked, regarding the question/answer about institutions showing what can be perceived as temporary wokeness, I too feel cautiously optimistic. So in that breath, can you speak about the importance and how we can continue to hold institutions accountable to preserve the intended narrative of Black voices and artists and not dilute the message?
Yeah. So to continue the accountability, I mean, from what I've seen in terms of exhibitions, they often, especially for larger institutions, are in some cases months to years out. So there's time for people on staff, people who are like learning, so different associates that come in, different fellows, I think that it's a wonderful opportunity for people to risk ego, and be vulnerable, and listen to what people have to say, about critique, around these things. And I think that, and to get critique doesn't mean you have to change something, but at least you can have a dialogue over, is this working? Who's the intended audience? Is it relevant for now? You know what I mean? What is the message that's going to be conveyed? For example, during all of these protests, everything was happening. I'm going to give the RISD Museum some critique real quick. They did a whole presentation. I love them. I love them. And as James Baldwin says about the United States, I love America. That is why I will continuously critique her. And I love the RISD Museum. They did a show on Gorham silver, because we, of course, here in Rhode Island had Gorham, and the silversmithing and creating was fabulous, but did some really drastic, devastating environmental things to the landscape. And then also, this is, we are in the middle of a recession, and this big show of opulence, so there were all of these economics kind of woven in, right? But from what I had heard, staff, and I mean, including security and others, had concerns, and those concerns were voiced. So, we are talking about, economically disenfranchised people. We were talking about, is this the right time for this? How can we create critique within the exhibition of the environmental, aspects, the results of those, and what are we doing now to address those things if they still have been left, bare? Is that land usable? How is the water? If it's not, what are the communities like? Who is impacted? So you saw this critique received, and that people were able to, receive that. So was it still opulent? It. Was it still decadent? Of course. Were they held accountable and holding themselves accountable for that exhibition and discussing it within the space of how there are some challenges around that? Let's not erase the historical. So I think the same can be done, and also in terms of the time period. A recession might not be the best time for a show like that. It might be okay.
It was a bit tone deaf, or maybe more than a bit tone deaf.
Oh, yes.
And they weren't addressing all the implications of that work.
Right.
Showing that work when they did, in the way they did.
Right.
And they weren't perhaps labeling it and speaking about it maybe in dialogues like this, or in museum tours that give people the sort of full 360-degree view.
Yes.
What this work can mean, and why is it important now, and what impact does it have today when we look at something from antiquity. So all of that is there. All of it. I'd like to shift gears again. We've got about 10 minutes left. And
okay,
in that time, I know it goes by really, really fast.
I hope I answered that question well. I mean, we could talk about Black art, Asian art, just switch out the theme, right? The thematics of those shows. But yeah, so I think just being very clear and being receptive and open, risk taking and vulnerable, checking the ego and allowing for discussion, and seeing how that can be a through line. And also giving yourself permission to say no and cancel the show, and or postpone it and bring something else in that's relevant or that lifts those people up. But go ahead.
Absolutely agree with all said. So maybe now we'll shift. We talked a bit about your body of work, and we can continue to do that. We talked about art institutions' responsibilities and the positions they've taken historically, and how we can start to change that. I also would like to address a little bit about the individual artists. I'm going to assume that many of the people in our audience right now are making art, or they are collecting art, but they have art in their lives in some significant way.
Beautiful.
So I'm wondering, what are the responsibilities for artists, especially those in the dominant culture, to contribute to a more just and equitable world? Let's say you're not an artist of color, and you're making work, and you're really interested in how you can comment on what's happening right now.
Oh, yeah.
What are their responsibilities as artists in your estimation?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that you should. I think you have a responsibility to speak, right? I feel like you as an artist and as a creative, being called in the way in which you were called, need to heed that call, right? And I say strongly, through your index, through your narrative, through your lived experience, right? I'll give an example. A friend really wanted to talk about Breonna Taylor. Great. Let's talk about Breonna Taylor. Really want to do a big mural. Absolutely. But think about it. This is what I, would advise. What compels you to create work about a person, about a subject that maybe is not within your sphere necessarily of knowing community or knowing the person? Breonna Taylor is a friend of, is a cousin of one of my friends. And that family was absolutely shattered, as all families have been with you when these things happen. Especially how it's been played out. And we all know generally to expect nothing from law enforcement or the justice system or anybody in righting that wrong. So with all of that history, to be able to have the privilege to create a massive mural, as a white person, about a Black woman, really think about the impact of that, and maybe even think, are you the one to tell that story? Perhaps the thing to do might be to consider, what part could you play in talking about it? You know what I mean? What are your experiences, related to your friend group that might have experiences with that? Or perhaps there's something around your witnessing of the kind of legislation, the kind of policing that allows for Black people to be killed with impunity, doing anything, nothing, anything in this country, and then be given no time, often not losing their jobs, most of the time, 99% of the time, 99.9% of the, not being charged, not being held to account. I mean, those are systems that are at work within white supremacy. And so, you as an artist who maybe identifies in those realms, and not with white supremacy, but you know what I'm saying is like, maybe as a white artist, to talk about those things, you know what I mean? And bring those to light. Like, how could you support, efforts, but do it in a way that is true to you, or true to your experience, or embodies your concerns, in a way that you can talk about that. You know what I mean? Could you do, and I've seen, I've seen like people just be like, oh, Michael Brown. I'm just like, again, the critique is, tell me about this.
Yeah.
Tell me why his death, what impacts you, or
Yeah.
why do you feel compelled? You know what I mean? Why
And
do you feel
what
compelled?
engagement have you had up to it to this point? And what engagement do you intend to have afterwards? How
Oh,
deeply do you want to go? How well educated you are about the history of what led up to these events?
okay.
Not let it be a one-off. In my estimation, that's really where the line is, where you cross over into inappropriate depictions, or perhaps work that, as you spoke about earlier, that maybe that's not your work to do, or maybe you're not ready to do that work.
Right.
That's
Right.
not where that individual is at that point from
Yeah.
a dominant culture in terms
Mhm.
of making commentary
Right.
on
Right.
people not in
Absolutely.
that culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I have, there are people who want to create work right now. I've heard white artists say like, well, Black Lives Matter is hot right now, and like I can be seen if I just like talk about these things. And, I'm glad they feel good enough to tell me that, because I look at them and I'm like, so we going to talk about this, is like, is that about advocacy and activism, or is that co-option for your personal gain so that you can sell a lot of work so that you can get a good place over here? I mean, and this goes back to the quote that I said about not being interested in the performance of care. I'm not interested in fake allyship either. I want, like evidence of, change sustained over
Mhm.
time. And really, there are two things that tell me a lot about people. One is their artwork, because I could that's tell people, show me your work and I'll tell you who you are. Like that's part of it, and also like the investment, right, as you were saying, like in concept, in activity, like, are you somebody who shows up, to protest, like capital punishment, or, have you been addressing the prison industrial complex, or are your actions in line, with your activities, your artistic activities, you know what I mean? And I like to, I just think it's important for people to have their own personal narrative. When I studied in London, I remember this time, one of my brothers, let's see, I'm just checking the time, I'll make it quick. One of my brothers, because for a myriad of reasons, was gang affiliated. A lot of it had to do with my father and absenteeism and, him needing support. And so he found it in the way that he found it. So he was part of the Crips. What was interesting is being away across the pond, as it were, was there was a crit where this very wealthy young man decided to dress in hip hop clothing and then have everybody else dress like in all red, and they were pretending they were the Bloods and like all this, and they have no idea, like none. And so, I go to critique them on that, and they're like, we don't want to hear it. So, which is interesting. So I'm like, oh, but you're performing Blackness, but you don't really like Blackness. Like, you don't really understand about the depth at why gangs are even a thing, and the affiliations and like all of that. But you want to kind of, produce it so that it's a spectacular show so that you can get clout. And that's
Yeah.
unacceptable to me. You need to have a reason.
Like the old saying, everything but the struggle, right? You want
Oh,
Blackness except the struggle, right?
that's
And yeah, the
wow.
unearned.
What
The
is it? A sermon? That was a sermon right there. Oh my God, Toby. Yes,
You
that's
can
facts.
you can preach, absolutely.
Facts.
Well, amazing as it is, we've actually come to the end of our hour, or very
What?
close to it.
Oh,
It's
I'm not
my
ready.
my clock says it's actually 7:30.
Wow.
So I know that there are more questions, but we've committed to signing off. So I want to thank you so much, Nafis, for taking this time to talk with me and share your ideas with our audience. Absolutely adore your work and adore you as well. I want to thank all of our audience for tuning in, and also thank Arts Worcester for providing this forum and this opportunity to be able to share with everyone. Thank you.
What a treat. What an
Good night
absolute
all.
treat.